programs in the fluid structure interactions. And Andrew's interest covers harnessing fluid-induced vibration for robust energy harvesting to utilize FSI for passive flow controls, which leads to estimation of unsteady aerodynamics flows. His group is well funded from NSF and Saudi national labs. He awarded an NSF grant research fellowship to perform his postdoc work. And he also received a teaching excellence at UIUC in 2020. So let's give the platform to Dr. Goza.
Thanks, Dr. Zhang. I really appreciate that. And more generally, I really appreciate the invite. It's always wonderful to see people interested in bio-inspired mechanics and the relevance of fluid mechanics in that setting. So really an honor to get to share some of these ideas with you and talk with people who are thinking about similar things and solving interesting problems. So this talk, I hope it's going to be a fun talk. As far as I'm concerned, I'm happy to be interrupted with questions along the way. So don't hesitate. I would love for this to be an informal discussion as much as that's of interest to you. The talk will be about a really beautiful and rich dynamical system that's called the inverted flag system. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But before I get into that, I just wanted to say a little bit about what my group works on more generally, particularly, since this particular topic is not especially relevant to bio-inspired locomotion specifically, but much of what we're thinking about is. So I wanted to give a little bit of a zoomed out discussion of that. So what do we think about within the group? Largely we're thinking about unsteady fluid dynamics and often in this fluid structure interaction setting. There are kind of three broad topic areas that we think about these days. One is, can we harness surface deformations for unsteady aerodynamic flow control? And I'll give a couple of examples of that. So one, this is a schematic. This is not a true aircraft in any sense of the word. We've just kind of patched this together. But the idea that I'm trying to convey in this is, and the paradigm that we're trying to think about within the group with collaborators at UIUC, in particular, Professor Catherine Matlack, who's a phononic materials expert. We're interested in introducing these materials with non-uniform structural properties. So these are called phononic materials. And using those, they're passively deformable and have a really rich and interesting set of dynamics that they can exhibit. And we're interested in embedding these into aerodynamic vehicles towards passive but adaptive flow control strategies for aerodynamic flow control. We're also really inspired by, these are images that I've extracted from some of Kenny Brewer's work at Brown University. And they're really motivated by animal flight, in which animals can have membrane wings, and they can adaptively tune the stiffness of these wings by activating their muscles in different ways. Professor Brewer's group is utilizing piezoelectric devices to be able to mimic that type of behavior. And we're interested in some similar questions for adaptively tuning motion within these structural settings towards this passive flow control scenario. So some of the questions, scientific questions that we're really excited about and that keep us up at night are, what are some of the fluid structure interaction mechanisms that exist at an interface between a modern material, so something like a phononic material or something that has a stiffness that can be adaptively tuned, and an unsteady flow? And whenever we think about this question of flow control or actuation, this lends itself nicely to questions about optimality. So in particular, are there surface deformations can be triggered through this passive material that are optimal for maximizing mean lift or minimizing mean drag or things like that? We're also interested in bio-inspired flow control and bio-inspired locomotion. So can we leverage fluid structure interaction for flow control? So here I'm showing this really cool picture of this owl that some of you may have seen that clearly has these feathers that passively deploy. And there have been there's some scientific evidence to show that this deployment property is beneficial to aerodynamic performance. And we want to kind of add to that by asking, how can fluid structure interaction be leveraged towards improving performance? And we're really grateful. This is a collaborative effort with Professor Amy Wissa in the Mechanical Science and Engineering Department here at UIUC. And we're very grateful for funding from NSF for that. And I'm really excited to work with Professor Wissa on that project. And then another situation is not leveraging fluid structure interaction in a flow control setting, so not as a flow control device, but within a locomotion strategy itself. So for example, you know, a number of bio-inspired devices, and many of you will know about this, are looking to mimic the locomotive strategies that exist in nature. And, you know, one of the things that I think is a really exciting direction is all of these devices, and indeed in nature, right, there's structural non-uniformity at play that, and I think there are a lot of open and interesting questions about how one can leverage structural non-uniformity towards improving these bio-inspired locomotion strategies. So how can we not just have these structures that are structurally non-uniform, but how do we optimize and tune this structural non-uniformity towards increasingly maneuverable bio-inspired aerial vehicles? And then finally, a project that, or a topic area that dates back to the work that I did as a PhD is in renewable energy harvesting. So can we look to target energy harvesting strategies that are driven by fluid structure interaction? So this is an example in what I'm showing here is a converging, diverging nozzle. Flow comes from left to right. And as it does, it excites vibrations in this beam. And this beam is in turn connected to this piezoelectric stack. So what happens is if you get the beam to vibrate at the right frequencies that are tuned with the natural frequency of this mechanical system, then it can make this mechanical system start to vibrate. And this mechanical system is coupled to a set of piezoelectric devices that can convert that vibration to electricity. And this is a much larger scale version of that. That's kind of a conceptual rendition that, without going into the details, is driven by similar flow-induced vibration mechanisms. So this is the topic area that today's talk is relevant and most relevant towards, but I did want to highlight some of the other things that we're thinking about, particularly given the group that we're talking about here. So in particular, how can we leverage fluid structure interaction to promote reliable and robust energy capture? Okay, now those are the topics that we're thinking about. I also want to say a little bit about how we address these topics. The first is as Dr. Zhang mentioned, we're a computational fluids group. And so one of our key thrusts is developing numerical methods to simulate these systems. Here's a picture from this inverted flag scenario that I'll show more examples of here. For people who are interested in the algorithm that we use, here are a couple of references that detail that algorithm and different facets of that algorithm. But we're also fluid mechanicians, and we like understanding and analyzing these rich dynamics in meaningful mechanistic ways. So here are a couple of just kind of fun figures that you know I think are really evocative of the types of analysis techniques we like to use. But I'll highlight some references, and I'll highlight in particular a reference that might be of specific interest to this group. This is work that I did as a postdoc under the supervision of Clancy Rowley, who was the PI for this work. And in this work, we looked at bio-inspired locomotion strategies and asked questions like, when we have a passively deformable locomotion device, what role can flexibility play in propulsive performance? And in particular, how relevant is resonance towards performance? And can we define resonance in ways that account for not just the structure, but this fully coupled fluid structure interaction system? So we do things like a stability analysis that account for both the fluid and the structure to unambiguously define resonance for this fully coupled locomotion system. And ask questions about how relevant that notion of resonance is setting of nonlinear locomotion strategies. So for those who are interested, I'm happy to chat offline or during the question section, or you're welcome to check out that paper. And most importantly, the thing that underpins all of this, right, I'm listing pictures of my grad students and myself, and we're a collegial, supportive, and passionate team that really enjoy what we're working on. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of what we're thinking about. Now, today's talk is most relevant to this setting of renewable energy harvesting. Okay, so here's the video that I want you to have in your mind when I'm talking about this physical system. This is the inverted flag system. What I'm showing in the color contours are contours of vorticity. So red is positive vorticity, blue is negative vorticity. and flows coming from left to right past what we call a flag that is clamped at its trailing edge. So this is why we call this an inverted flag. Rather than having the boundary condition at the leading edge, we have the boundary condition at the trailing edge. Now, you can see that this flag can undergo very large amplitude motions that are on the order of the flag length. And this is why the system is interesting. For renewable energy harvesting reasons, we might want these large amplitude motions as compared to the amplitudes that one can obtain by fixing the flag at its leading edge. Now, I'll note one other thing, which is that we call this an inverted flag. That's the nomenclature that's used in this community. But of course, if this were really a floppy flag, right, this would just totally flop over to the other side. So there's a significant bending rigidity here, right? There's a non-trivial bending rigidity that's able to resist the flow in a significant way that doesn't just make the flag flop over. Okay, so that's the video I want you to have in your mind when I talk about the system. So what are we going to talk about today with respect to this inverted flag system? So first, what are some of the fluid structure interaction mechanisms that drive the dynamics of this really rich and beautiful system? I'll talk a little bit about that, but I won't have time to go through all the details. So the interested listener is referred to this paper. I'm happy to follow up with questions offline. In the second part, I'll talk a little bit about how do we develop reduced order models for this complex system. And I'll highlight up front that really my aim here is to advertise the work that's being led by Jared Callahan and Steve Brunton. So Jared is an excellent grad student in Steve's group, and we're collaborating on this effort, but they're really leading this. So I just kind of want to advertise the really exciting work that I think is exciting that they're doing. And then the third part of this is how do the dynamics change, and how do we understand the change of the dynamics if all of a sudden we have flags that don't have uniform material properties but have non-uniform material properties? And in particular, we'll focus on flags with non-uniform stiffness properties. I'll just kind of highlight that there's a potential actuation framework that's suggested by this study, right? So if we can understand these dynamics with non-uniform stiffness, then maybe we can think about adaptively tuning the stiffness in time to get the flag to exhibit the dynamics that we want, for example, renewable energy capture, right? And I'll highlight as well that while this is not a bio-inspired locomotion talk, and in fact, this is a bit of an indulgence. This is particularly this part 3 is something that I've been staying up late at night thinking about. So I wanted to just kind of share what I've been working on. But I think there are relevant strategies for bio-inspired locomotion here, right? How do we incorporate structural non-uniformity towards control to achieve an objective, right? In this case, maybe it's large amplitude flapping, but in bio-inspired locomotion, it might be better propulsive benefits, right? Okay, and I'll highlight that this actuation framework is something that's becoming increasingly exciting and possible because of advances in material science. So piezoelectric devices that can be actuated on really fast timescales and that are lightweight and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's where we're headed. So let's start with part 1 and address the physics of this really rich dynamical system in the case of uniform material properties. Okay, so as a community, we actually already know a decent amount about this system. And in particular, we know that there are 3 driving dimensionless parameters. So there's the Reynolds number that we all know and love, and I won't focus on that too much in this talk. There's also a non-dimensionalized version of the flexural rigidity or the bending stiffness, right? So here I'm taking EI, the dimensional bending stiffness, and normalizing it by some notion of stiffness in the fluid that involves the dynamic pressure, right? And addition of length scales. And then we also have a dimensionless mass ratio. So here I'm taking the inertia of the structure flag, and I'm normalizing that inertia by some notion of inertia within the fluid, right? So F is fluid, S is structure. Okay, so these are the driving dimensionless parameters, but what's actually been found is that the dynamics are pretty robust to changes in Reynolds number and to mass ratio. There's some caveats to that I'll talk about, but by and large, the most significant parameter that drives the dynamics of the system is this dimensionless stiffness term. So let me talk a little bit about how the system changes as we change the stiffness. So if we have a flag that is very, very stiff, right, then perhaps intuitively, as flow moves this way, the flag won't be perturbed, right? It'll remain in this undeflected position for all time. If we decrease the stiffness further, then the flag will deflect from that undeflected position and remain in a steady deflected state with small amplitude. If we decrease the stiffness further still, then we'll start to see small amplitude oscillations about that steady deflected state. So what I'm showing in each of these images is a time lapse. You only see one flag here because it enters into a steady state and stays there. But here you're starting to see kind of a breadth of these pictures, and that's reflective of the fact that there's small amplitude flapping. If we decrease the stiffness further, then we see a transition towards large amplitude flapping. And this corresponds to the video that I showed a few slides ago. And then finally, if we decrease the flapping further, the stiffness further still, the flag will deflect completely to one side and undergo small amplitude motion. So, and then of course, you know, if we decrease the stiffness further still, eventually it'll flop over and start to resemble a conventional flag, but I'm sort of neglecting those dynamics here. So these regimes have been found by a number of researchers that I'm highlighting here. And we also already know a lot about the physical mechanisms that drive these regime changes. So let me talk a bit about that. So the first is, it's been identified that the transition away from this stable, undeflected state is due to a divergence instability. So as we decrease the stiffness, it's a divergence instability that is independent of the mass that causes this departure from this undeflected state. There's also been a lot of connections of this particular regime, large amplitude flapping, that have been identified to vortex-induced vibration. So essentially what this means is that in this regime, in a number of settings, there's a synchronization between the vortex shedding that occurs and flag flapping. And so that synchronization bears many of the similar traits that are identified in vortex-induced vibration, for example, of cylinders. And commensurate with this observation is the observation that Ryu et al. Made that for certain mass ratios, no flapping was found below a Reynolds number of about 50. So this is intuitive in the sense that we would expect bluff body vortex shedding to go away at this low Reynolds number. And indeed, when one sees shedding go away, one sees a lack of flapping. So this is again a testament to the role of vortex shedding and flapping. Rajat Mittal's group also found that this regime is really driven by a bluff body instability. So what happens here is the flag will deflect to one side, and once it's deflected to that one side, it looks like a bluff body to the flow. And so the flow sees that and responds by triggering vortex shedding. And then this flapping amplitude can be shown to synchronize directly with that vortex shedding. So this is really kind of passively driven by this bluff body vortex shedding instability. And then finally, I'll notice that, and I haven't pictured this regime here, but Sater et al. Identified that chaotic flapping is possible in this system. Okay, so there's a lot that we know about the system, what regimes exist and some of the mechanisms that drive those regimes, but what are some open questions that we were interested in addressing? The first of these is, what triggers this onset of flapping? Why do we go from a steady state to one that involves dynamics? What triggers that? The second is, we wanted to probe a little bit further the role of vortex shedding and vortex-induced vibration, right? So is vortex-induced vibration always the trigger for flapping of this large amplitude regime? We wanted to characterize chaotic flapping a little bit further. And then finally, we wanted to borrow methodology from the dynamical systems community, and rather than showing you a regime by showing you a different time-lapse image every time, can we convey all of these regimes succinctly using bifurcation diagrams? So how are we going to tackle these questions? We'll use nonlinear simulations and a global stability analysis. As I've mentioned, the stiffness is the driving dimensionless parameter for this system. So a lot of what we'll look at will be varying this uniform stiffness and looking at a couple of different Reynolds numbers. And I'll highlight low Reynolds number 20 as really being driven by our desire to probe all of vortex shedding, right? So by looking at this low Reynolds number, we can really ask, in the absence of settings where one would expect vortex shedding, can we still see flapping? And we'll look at a few different mass ratios that range about 4 orders of magnitude. Okay, so let's start with a Reynolds number of 200. And the first thing that we'll look at is identifying and trying to build bifurcation diagrams for this system. So what I'm going to show you with these bifurcation diagrams on the y-axis is what I call delta tip, which is the transverse or y displacement of the tip or leading edge of the flag. And on the x-axis, I'm showing 1 on the stiffness. So as we move to the right, the flag is becoming more flexible. So we'll build this bifurcation diagram in stages. The first thing that I'll show is equilibrium states for this system. So here, I'm showing 1 on stiffness parameter, and what we see is an equilibrium state, which corresponds to the undeflected state. And this looks like this, right? So the undeflected state is an equilibrium of the system, and it is associated with a flag that is undeflected and a steady symmetric wake that has this vortex structure. And as we saw in the time-lapse images, that undeflected state is stable, indicated by the solid line. But as we decrease the stiffness far enough, then eventually that becomes unstable, and that's indicated by the dashed line, right? And as has been shown, that's due to a divergence in stability. Now, one thing that we were really excited to find is that there are actually more equilibria of the system. And in particular, there's an equilibrium that develops at the onset of instability of this undeflected equilibrium. And that is a deflected equilibrium, which is stable for a small range of stiffnesses and then becomes unstable. And so in particular, that small deflection steady state that I showed is formally an equilibrium of the fully coupled system. And because we're able to see it in the nonlinear simulations, that's reflective of this fact that it is indeed a stable equilibrium for some range of stiffnesses, and then it becomes unstable. But even when it's unstable, the equilibrium is there. It's just not visible in practice because it's unstable. To give you some images in your mind of what the fully coupled system looks like in this deflected equilibrium state, here are a couple of different examples of that. Okay, but as we know, this system also exhibits flapping. So how do we characterize flapping on this bifurcation diagram? So I'm going to put a bunch of markers on that same bifurcation diagram from before, and then we'll talk through a little bit about how they're drawn. So let's take this example here. This example corresponds to this large amplitude flapping regime. How did I draw these markers? So the way that I did this is I looked at a time trace of the tip displacement and tip velocity. So tip displacement, tip velocities versus time. But what we can do is we can also draw this not as 2 separate plots versus time, but as a phase portrait of velocity versus displacement. And in doing that, what we see after these initial transients, if I just plot, for example, from here on, I would see a periodic limit cycle occur, right? And there's this orbit that the system gets attracted to and it stays there. So the way that I drew these markers is by taking a 0 velocity cross section. This is a Poincaré section of this phase portrait. And everywhere where this curve intersects with this orange 0 velocity slice, so in particular at about -0.8 and +0.8, I draw these markers, right? So I want to emphasize that there are not 2 markers at this point and this point. There are many, many, many markers just on top of one another, which is reflective of the fact that there's limit cycle dynamics happening here. So what about this kind of richer set of dynamics? This is the chaotic regime that I'll talk a little bit more in a few slides. And if we look at the same time trace images of the tip velocity and tip displacement, we see a richer set of dynamics. And commensurate with that, if I take a 0 velocity cross section of the phase portrait, then now I see intersections of this blue curve with the orange curve at many different locations. And so I've got a much denser population of this bifurcation diagram at this particular stiffness value. So this chaotic regime, I think, is a really nice indicator of why we wanted to draw the bifurcation diagrams in this way, right? If we just plotted the peak to peak amplitude, we would really miss a bifurcation change from limit cycle dynamics and large amplitude flapping to something that is no longer that, right? So this helps us see that bifurcation change that might be difficult to see otherwise. Okay, so what I did was show a bifurcation diagram for this one mass ratio. But let me show you what happens as we change the mass. So in particular, we see the same set of dynamics, a transition from undeflected, steady deflected, small amplitude flapping in the green markers, large amplitude flapping, to chaotic flapping, deflection flapping. And we see the same regime transitions across the board, except that the large mass ratios don't exhibit chaotic flapping. There's this transition from large amplitude flapping that goes directly to the large deflection state. But barring that, the regime transitions are the same. Okay, so we can build bifurcation diagrams to succinctly convey the dynamics. You might recall that another question we wanted to answer was, can we understand what triggers this onset of flapping in the first place? Why do we go from a steady deflected state to an unsteady state that's characterized by dynamics, right? Changes in the state over time. So the punchline answer to that is that the onset of flapping is triggered by a supercritical Hopf bifurcation. So in particular, what I can do is I can look at this steady and, for these stiffnesses, stable deflected state. And I can do a stability analysis about that state. And what I would find is a set of complex conjugate eigenvectors, which for this range of stiffnesses are stable. They have a negative, they decay in time. But then at this transition point, that set of eigenvectors becomes unstable and triggers the onset of flapping, which in the nonlinear regime saturates to some finite amplitude. So let me show you that that's indeed what happens. I'll look at a specific mass ratio. And what I'll do here is take a flag of a specific stiffness. And when I look at that leading eigenvector and I see that it has a negative growth rate, so I would predict that this leading eigenvector decays in time. Indeed, if I look at a nonlinear simulation, I would see a steady deflected equilibrium state. And so there's no frequency, right? There are no dynamics, right? So there's no frequency associated with the simulation. I see no flapping. If I decrease the stiffness just a bit so that now my leading eigenvector becomes unstable, then I do see flapping in the nonlinear simulations. And as is required when we're really near the onset of instability, the frequency of flapping is very well predicted by the leading global mode. And I won't dwell on this point, but you can do the same thing for the other, for another set of mass ratios and see exactly the same behavior. So you decrease the stiffness, the leading mode goes from stable to unstable. And in the nonlinear simulation, you go from no flapping to flapping, and the frequency is well predicted by the global mode. And just to kind of put an image in your mind of what this looks like, here's a picture of the real and imaginary parts of the leading global mode at a few different mass ratios. So you see there are these unsteady structures in the wake that are commensurate with this slight unsteadiness and slight flapping in the flag. Okay, so another thing we said we wanted to tackle was, can we characterize this chaotic flapping regime? And the punchline that I want to convey here is that it's not a coincidence that this chaotic regime lies in bifurcation space, in this parameter space, in between large amplitude flapping and large deflection flapping. So in particular, if I look at a phase portrait of this large amplitude flapping regime, right, that looks like this. We've seen this before. And if I look at a phase portrait of this deformed mode regime, that looks like this. So there's a large deflection state. There's a large mean offset associated with the flag being here, and then small amplitude flapping about that mean offset. And if I go back to this chaotic flapping regime, right, this looks like a superposition of these two regimes. So indeed, what one sees in chaotic flapping is this state where we see a desynchronization in the vortex-induced vibration behavior associated with large amplitude flapping. So the flag can't quite continue to keep pace with the vortex shedding. So there's this desynchronization, but it's not totally in the deformed mode state either. So this is an attractor that's defined by seemingly random alternating between a large amplitude flap and getting stuck on one side and doing a couple of these and then going back and forth, right? And so this is the reason behind why the dynamics are chaotic, is we can't predict, right, when it's going to stay on one side or go to the other side. Okay, so we can add a little bit of fidelity to our understanding of what this chaotic regime looks like, and the bifurcation diagrams and phase portraits help us do that. The last thing that I wanted to tackle for this uniform stiffness setting is, can we bring more fidelity to our understanding of the role of vortex shedding and vortex-induced vibration? The way that we'll tackle that in this presentation is by looking at a low Reynolds number case for which, if we had a bluff body, there would not be vortex shedding. And we're going to ask, do we see flapping continue to occur? So for that, I'll show you some bifurcation diagrams. And what we can see is that low ratios for flags that are light with respect, I don't see flapping. And this is exactly consistent with what Roux et al. Observed. So what they found is that as they decrease the stiffness, they will never see flapping. And we see that that's true, right? We see the transition from a steady undeflected state to a steady deflected state. And there are no dynamics that ever occur. But one thing that we thought was really interesting is that if you increase the mass ratio, there's this transition where now you can see dynamics, and there's an onset of small amplitude flapping dynamics, and then eventually to large amplitude flapping dynamics. So this suggests to us that there are non-classical vortex-induced vibration mechanisms that can trigger the onset of flapping. I'm seeing a question in the chat. The simulations are high fidelity Navier-Stokes in 2D combined with a geometrically nonlinear beam structural model. Yeah. Yeah, I should have clarified that. Thanks for the question. And I'm happy to follow up if any of that's unclear. Right, so we see this onset of flapping that can occur even at low Reynolds numbers, which tells us that there are these non-VIV mechanisms for flapping. And I'll just highlight again that the same transition to flapping is again triggered by a supercritical Hopf bifurcation. So as we see a transition from stable equilibrium to flapping, that is commensurate with the leading mode going from stable to unstable, and the frequencies are commensurate with one another for both of these mass ratios for which flapping occurs. And again, just to put an image of your mind, here's what flapping looks like in this setting. Oh, and sorry, I'm seeing a chat. So I think I may have misinformed you. I was happy to take questions, but maybe the protocol is to wait until the end. So I'm sorry for misinforming people, and I'll just leave them until the end. Okay, so let's summarize what we talked about with these uniform property systems. So we were able to draw bifurcation diagrams for the system and bring a little bit more fidelity to representing these dynamics. We identified that the onset of flapping was due to a supercritical Hopf bifurcation. We identified chaotic flapping and characterized it as seemingly random switching between large amplitude and large deflection regimes. And we identified that no chaotic flapping occurs for large mass ratios. We also looked at small Reynolds numbers and found that no flapping occurs for low mass ratios, but that flapping does occur for large mass ratios. The transition, the onset of flapping is caused by the same mechanism. And there is flapping that's possible without vortex shedding, which speaks to non-classical VIV mechanisms. Again, for more details, check out this reference, or I'm happy to follow up later. Okay, second part of the talk. So how do we develop reduced order models for these inverted flags with uniform material properties? We'll restrict our focus here to the specific Reynolds number of 200 and one specific mass ratio of 0.5. And this is just because these were some of the richer set of dynamics. So if we can capture these effectively, that's a good indicator that there's a pretty robust reduced order model at play here. And I'll again highlight, right, that this is really work that's being led in Steve Brenton's group, and in particular, Jared Callahan, a great grad student of his, is really doing the heavy lifting. So I just kind of want to advertise preliminary, but I think exciting work that they're sinking their teeth into. So the first thing that I'll show for this is developing a model that leverages sparse regression. So this is a framework that's coming out of Steve Brenton's group that they call SINDY. And they use this model to develop a set of normal form dynamics for the small amplitude flapping regimes. So in particular, their model is built on the following representation of the flag. So if they look at a given coordinate position on the flag that's given by these XY coordinates, then it can be represented in polar coordinates in terms of these R and theta variables. And you can see that these are all parametrized by S, the arc length from the root of the flag, or geometrically nonlinear Euler Bernoulli beam, and the way it's represented here. And then there's also this angle of attack that is defined in this way, right? So one takes a line from the tip of the flag to the root, and the angle that it makes with the horizontal axis is the so-called angle of attack. So using this definition, SINDY is able to find a form for these equations that looks like this. And you can see that there are a bunch of free parameters, the various n and epsilon parameters, and new parameters and gamma parameters, and SINDY picks those out, right? What those parameters should be. And one of the cool features of this is that when you look at the SINDY model, it actually does quite well. And I'll highlight that this is non-trivial because it does quite well at capturing multiple bifurcations, right? It captures a bifurcation from this equilibrium to this equilibrium, and then again, from this equilibrium to small amplitude flapping. And what I'm showing in the markers is the DNS high fidelity simulation data. And what I'm showing with these lines is what was obtained using this SINDY extracted model. So this is great, and it does really well actually in this small amplitude regime, capturing both flapping and the deflected equilibrium states. But we wanted to ask, can we motivate this model a little bit more physically? And the answer was yes. So let me say a little bit more about that. And it's actually a pleasure to see Professor Dow here. There's a lot of methodology in aerodynamic modeling and modeling of fluid structural interaction that's at play here. So it's a real treat to get to convey that in front of Professor Dow. Anyway, so Jared went on to do this and motivate that model physically. And one of the key assumptions here is that the flag shape can be represented entirely by the angle of attack. So this is somewhat intuitive. You might have seen in these time-lapse images that the flag, for all of the regimes that we're looking at, exhibits basically first mode flapping. So basically what that suggests is if you have the angle of attack, you should be able to back out the position of any point along the flag as a function of its arc length. And so this is indicated here by expanding this polar coordinate representation of the flag coordinates in powers of the angle of attack alpha. And then if you turn the crank and go through the Euler-Lagrange machinery to develop a set of governing equations subject to some fluid loading that we're just for now going to generically call C sub n, then you arrive at an expression that looks like this, right? So these are the theta terms that come up, and these are the R terms that come up. And you can see that this Cn term is just a representation of the, as we mentioned, of the fluid loading, which we decompose into the lift and drag components with respect to the angle of attack. So how do we model the lift or the fluid loading? The way that we model that is as given here. So we write this in terms of its derivative with respect to the angle of attack. And then there are these other terms here. And basically the way that Jared set this up is this term gives us a quasi-steady metric for the effective angle of attack, and you can see that there are lag effects that that are allowed to be incorporated due to the rate of change at which the flag is moving. And then this here is a Kirchhoff model for trailing edge separation. So essentially, this F term needs to be 0 or 1, depending on whether the flow is fully attached or fully separated. And Jared's first pass at this was to represent this using a simple Gaussian profile. So if you write F as a Gaussian, and that's represented in terms of alpha and alpha dot, and you retain only leading order terms in these quantities, then the result of that Gaussian representation plugged in here is this. You get this form that falls out of that. And so the punchline, when you plug this back into this set of governing equations, is that you get a form that's exactly the same as what was extracted by SINDY. So that's kind of a nice punchline, is that we can physically motivate and build intuition for why SINDY extracted the equations that it did. Okay, so that's great. But what I've shown you is just the ability to capture the small amplitude dynamics and the small amplitude regimes. A lot of the most interesting regimes, both dynamically and scientifically, but also in terms of the applications that we're interested in, renewable energy harvesting, are related to large amplitude flapping. So can we capture those? This is preliminary work, and the answer is it's still in progress, but there's some promising outcomes here that I want to share. So the first is that the key enabler to being able to make this work is to incorporate a latent variable into the dynamics, and we'll just call that X. So I'm showing here the model that's being used to represent these dynamics to account for the large amplitude regime as well. And this equation here is the addition of a latent state and dynamics for that latent state. And you can see that latent state appear here as well, right? So the latent state is starting to appear in all of these systems and to have its own set of dynamics. The reason it's called a latent state is I can't tell you that X has some physical meaning, right? It's some quantity that is associated with the fluid that is a latent variable, right? It's not obvious what its physical interpretation is. And this is part of why this is a work in progress. But other than that, the form of the dynamics is the same, right? So this is the same dynamical equation that was arrived through Euler-Lagrange and through SINDY. And this model for the unsteady aerodynamic loading is also the same. There's this derivative of the aerodynamic loading with respect to angle of attack. And this term, the same Kirchhoff model for separation, it's just that here we haven't restricted ourselves to leading order terms in alpha and alpha dot. This is the full Gaussian representation, right? So this is the same representation for the aerodynamic model, but with F not reduced to leading order terms. And that's important, right? Because this thing is undergoing large amplitude flapping. We don't want to keep just the first terms in the expansion. Okay, but other than that, the form of the equation is the same. So I'll reiterate, right? We still haven't rigorously justified these equations using either physical arguments or data driven through SINDY. But I will highlight that what made Jared go this route was that this is actually the same form of the equations that are used in the Unanswered dynamic stall model. And there's a promising outcome that comes from this, which is that this model is able to capture now not just the same regime transitions that were identified before, but also the onset of large amplitude flapping. One thing I haven't shown for the nonlinear simulations is that this system actually exhibits hysteresis. And this reduced order model can also capture those hysteretic effects, which is pretty neat. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about reduced order modeling for the uniform system. And I'll spend the next maybe 5 or so minutes talking about non-uniform structural properties, incorporating that into the inverted flux system and asking how that changes the dynamics. Again, just for kind of simplicity of presentation, I'll focus on this one Reynolds number and one mass ratio, just because in the uniform case, this gave really interesting dynamics that included chaos and large amplitude flapping and so on and so forth. So I thought this would be a fun one to compare against. So to ground our investigation, let me go back to the uniform property flag and highlight the dynamics again. So again, we see a steady undeflected state that transitions to a steady deflected state, to small amplitude flapping, to large amplitude flapping, to chaos, and then to the deflected or deformed mode. And what I'm showing in the bottom plot here is the spectral content of this. So I really like this way of conveying the dynamics succinctly. So in particular, what I'm showing here is anytime you see a set of colors, that means there's a peak in the power spectral density plot. So for example, at this stiffness, there are 2 peaks in the power spectral density plot, one at about 0.1 and one at about 0.05, let's say. Now, the spread in those peaks is the frequency range that contains at least 5% of the energy of that peak. So here, right, you can see that there's a peak near 0.09 and there's relatively small spread, right? But here there's a peak near about 0.04 and there's significant range of frequencies that kind of share the energy. So this is my way of representing whether the dynamics are broadband or really kind of peaky, right, and have sharp peaks. So what we see in these regime transitions is that in this onset of large amplitude flapping, shedding and flapping synchronize, right? You start to see flapping that occurs at a frequency of 0.2. And that's kind of a magic number when we have vortex shedding, because we know that vortex shedding occurs for a vast range of systems at a Struhal number of 0.2. So there's this synchronization of vortex shedding and flapping that occurs. And that is this kind of vortex induced vibration behavior. And what we can see is as we decrease the stiffness, there starts to be a desynchronization of flapping and shedding, right? So the flapping frequency is starting to decrease and decrease and decrease to the point where it's going to not be able to continue to synchronize with the shedding frequency that the fluid wants to exhibit, right? And as this desynchronization continues, eventually chaos ensues, and there has to be this random switching between flapping and the large deflection state here. And commensurate with that random switching is an onset of broadband frequencies, right? This is a chaotic set of dynamics. And there's this random switching that occurs. And then eventually we see the trigger to the deformed mode state. And you do see some broadband content here, but really by far the dominant peak, if you were to look at a power spectral density of one of these plots, is one that occurs at a Struhal number of 0.2, right? And that's, again, because in this regime, this system is driven by bluff body vortex shedding, and there's just kind of passive motion that's being forced by the Struhal number 0.2. And you also see some frequencies of the harmonics as well of this 0.2. Okay, so that's what happens in the uniform flag. What happens in the non-uniform flag? Well, how do we define structural non-uniformity? So the way that I parametrized it here, and this is motivated actually by Daniel Florian and Clancy Rowley, who did a similar study with bio-inspired locomotion in an inviscid setting. And I really like their approach. So the way that they did this is they wrote their stiffness distribution in terms of the mean stiffness that they want, and a linear combination of these Legendre polynomials. So just as a reminder what the first couple Legendre polynomials look like. Now, the reason that I really like this representation is if you look at the integral over this way that I've parametrized the flag from -1 to 1, then the integral of any of these Legendre polynomials is 0. So in particular, if I were to take this quantity and call it A, then what's nice is by changing the coefficients, so changing A, I don't change the mean, right? Because when I take the integral of each of these terms, they're going to contribute 0. So this is a really nice way of systematically decoupling the effect of distribution, so changing C1 and C2, without changing the mean, right? I don't want to change the distribution and say, well, the dynamics are different, but also the mean is different, right? So this lets us look at both effects separately. Now, of course, I'll just make a note that these C sub j's have to be chosen so that the stiffness is everywhere non-negative, right? I can't have a stiffness that is 0 or less than 0 anywhere along the flag. So that's a restriction on the C's. So how did I choose the C sub j's? Also, let me say that in today's talk, we'll consider linear and quadratic distributions. So n equals 1 and n equals 2, n is given here. I'll look at different mean stiffness values, one that corresponds to the deformed mode, chaotic flapping, large amplitude flapping, and the steady deflected mode in the uniform stiffness case. So 4 different mean stiffnesses. And for each mean stiffness, I will consider either a linear or a quadratic distribution, and I'll vary the C sub j's accordingly. How do I pick the C sub j's? Well, what I will do is for each mean stiffness, so here's an example for the mean stiffness of 0.35, then if I were to try to take a quadratic representation, this diamond-looking shape is the set of feasible C1 and C2. So if I'm outside of this, then I'm going to have a negative stiffness somewhere along my flag. So everywhere in here is where I'm allowed to pick a C1 or a C2. And the way that I set this up is I just uniformly distributed a set of sampling points within this feasible set. And just to show you what some of these look like, here are the stiffness distributions that correspond to the green markers that I just come from a random sampling within this feasible set. So you can see we get a fairly rich range of quadratic distributions that come from this sampling. Okay, so what I thought was really interesting when I looked through this, I'm showing the same bifurcation diagrams and spectral content now as a function of just C1. So this is the linear case. And what you see is that C1 acts like a bifurcation parameter in much the same way that the stiffness did, right? So undeflected, steady deflected, small amplitude flapping, large amplitude flapping, chaos, small amplitude flapping, right? I mean, it's exactly the same. And so this made me think, okay, well, this looks like a uniform stiffness flag, but with an effective stiffness that's different from the mean stiffness, right? This was at a fixed mean stiffness of 0.35. And so the mean stiffness is not giving me the effective stiffness, but there's some effective stiffness in this system. So how do I motivate this notion of an effective stiffness? Well, let's look at an Euler Bernoulli beam in a vacuum. If I look at the leading 6 modes or so, we can see that they have kind of remarkably the same shapes as I change the stiffness distribution. And in particular, the first mode is quite similar for many, many different values of C1. And if I look at the natural frequencies, so I'm showing the imaginary part of the eigenvalue of these modes, so the natural frequencies, and I look at them as a function of index, then if I look at this first mode in particular, right, let's see what happens. So as I change C1 from 0, which is, I always get this wrong, this one here, then that's the natural frequency of the uniform case. If C1 becomes positive, and if you think about what C1 means in the definition of these Legendre polynomials, C1 is a slope. So C1 positive means I'm isolating stiffness towards the trailing or clamped edge. Then the natural frequency goes up. But the natural frequency scales as the square root on the stiffness. So that means that as I isolate stiffness towards the trailing edge or the clamped edge, then my effective stiffness is going up. And conversely, if I isolate stiffness towards the unclamped, towards the free end, then I'm decreasing the effective stiffness. So this suggests a protocol, right? What I can do is for a given C1 value, I can figure out what its leading natural frequency is. And I can ask, what's a uniform stiffness flag in vacuum that has this same natural frequency? And I'll call that the effective stiffness. Now, a quick word on intuition. Expect that localizing stiffness towards either the trailing or the leading edge towards the trailing or clamped end would lead to a larger effective stiffness. Well, remember that the strain energy scales as this quantity, where this is the stiffness distribution, and this is the curvature, which scales as the second derivative of displacement. So this notion of stiffness is a weighted notion of stiffness that's weighted towards areas with higher curvature. So if I put my stiffness towards regions that are going to curve more, then I'm going to have more strain energy, so more effective stiffness. And that's exactly what happens by putting the stiffness towards the clamped end, right? That's where the flag is going to exhibit the most curvature. Okay, so that's why we should expect localizing stiffness towards the trailing or clamped end should increase the effective stiffness. Now let's ask ourselves, how well does using this effective stiffness represent the dynamics? The answer is pretty well. So I'm showing you cases for all of the linear distributions that I considered. So mean stiffness values of 0.15, 0.25, 0.35, and 0.45. And this is in total about 74 runs. And what you can see is remarkably a really similar set of dynamics. I've color coded these using the transitions for the uniform stiffness flag. So you can see actually that there's some chaotic flapping that is not perfectly well predicted by this effective stiffness, right? This is not the deformed mode. There's some chaotic flapping happening here. But apart from that, we see the same regime transitions, and we see that there are the same dynamics at play, right? So the onset of synchronization and vortex-induced vibration, desynchronization, which triggers chaos, and then the onset of strong peaks at 0.2 that are driving the dynamics in this deformed mode regime. And I won't belabor the point too much more than I have, but I'll just say the same transitions occur here as well, right? With quadratic stiffness distribution. So again, the same collection of mean stiffnesses are here, a total of about 83 runs. And I'll just kind of highlight that the same transitions occur with some deviations in the limit cycle a little bit. Okay, so I'm a little bit over time. I'll just leave my conclusions here, and I would love to take any questions. Thank you for your patience and time.
Yeah, thanks for this very impressive and very clear talk. So if anyone has any questions, please just raise your hand or you can just open your mic.
Yes, I have a couple of questions and a comment or two, if I might. First question is about higher Reynolds numbers and possible 3D effects in the flow field. Do you have some plans to look into that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I will highlight that there are other people who have looked at this, and I think that's important to note. The first study on this was actually done at a Reynolds number of about 30,000, and much of the experimental work has kind of lived in that Reynolds number range. So there are quantitative differences in the dynamics, but kind of remarkably, the same regime transitions occur as long as the flag has a sufficiently large aspect ratio, right? So the two, I would say, kind of missing pieces to this study are 3D effects and the effect, and related to that, and 3D high Reynolds number effects, and related to that, the role of aspect ratio. And so the same regime transitions occur for those cases, which is kind of interesting. And when things are non-dimensionalized by a Struhel number, for example, then the same frequencies occur across these regime transitions. To more directly answer your question, I do have a personal interest in studying these 3D dynamics in more detail, but that's maybe a little bit further down the road. Our current computational framework is two-dimensional.
Okay. A couple of comments. Your latent dynamics model,
yes,
it looks a lot like a van der Pol oscillator, and people have been using van der Pol oscillators to represent flow dynamics behind bluff bodies for at least several decades. So you might want to look into some of that literature. It's actually mostly in the civil engineering literature, although there are some aero people who look at it too. And the other thing is about your non-uniform stiffness. I think that's an interesting study, but an experimentalist would likely vary the thickness. And of course, if you vary the thickness, that will contribute both mass and stiffness. So that might be an interesting thing for you to look at.
Yes, those are both great points. To speak to the latent dynamics, I would have to talk more with Jared, but I know he did look into these van der Pol oscillators to some extent. And I think the main bottleneck that he had was he was able to get that to work at a given stiffness, but it was really hard to get a normal form that would work sort of across different stiffness values. But maybe that's something he can revisit, and I'm not sure the extent to which he's
okay. Nice talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's a good point about the non-uniform stiffness distributions as well. Yeah, so I think there are interesting questions about how this would be done experimentally. I mean, with respect to, so one thing is it would be interesting if experimentalists would be interested in using piezoelectric materials to try to change the stiffness without changing the thickness. But short of that, I think it's totally true that changing the thickness is one way to do that. And then it would be interesting to think about making a commensurate change in mass to see if one could get the simulations and the experiments to sort of crosstalk. I think that's a really good point. Yeah, thank you for the questions and comments.
So I saw like there's a message in the chat, which is he asked like, how do you predict the bifurcation profile with change when your flag is 3D or low aspect ratio?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the short answer is that there's no short answer. The dynamics can be kind of richly different with respect to those parameters. A slightly longer answer that tries to simplify it a little bit is that these same regime transitions occur when the aspect ratio is large, but when the aspect ratio is low, then there's a regime where it's sort of low, but not like, you know, very, very small relative to the thickness or on the order of the thickness. And then there's a kind of asymptotic limit where it reaches the thickness. Flapping ceases in that other limit, but within this kind of intermediate limit where you have a flag that is significantly larger than the thickness, but still there are significant 3D effects, you can get a very rich and wide set of dynamics. John Sater has looked into some of that if you're interested in following up, as well as Michael Paidosis's group has done some work analytically and experimentally modeling these 3D dynamics. So the short answer is the dynamics are very rich, and those are the references I would point you to.
So there's another message like say, is there some kind of document to justify the attendance as a, oh, sorry, this is for us.
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a shot, but maybe that one, you're more the experts.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. We can like left the question to Disha.
That's a good question. I think let's like focus on Andres today, and we can Pablo. Why not send us a mail and we can discuss this? Like, what do you want though?
So is there any other questions like regarding the talk?
Yeah, hi, Chandan here. It's a very interesting talk, and I have a couple of questions because I could relate it to the chaotic dynamics to the dynamics of a flapping foil very nicely. So my first question would be like, you showed a very nice transition from a chaos to a high amplitude, but a small oscillation regime for the higher value, right? So like, could you please elaborate what kind of bifurcation was there, like that underlines that phenomena? Like, did you look into that?
No, I mean, it's a good question. It's hard to figure out because it's hard to know what the underlying attractor is to do a stability analysis of, right? I mean,
yeah, I guess it, yeah.
Even knowing the bifurcation, for example, from here to here is not obvious, right? One would have to do a Floquet analysis about this limit cycle and see how that goes unstable, right? We know physically that for these low mass ratios, the physical mechanism is, you know, something that's highly related to a vortex-induced vibration for these low mass ratios. But even then, the specific characterization of that bifurcation is not obvious, and doing it from the chaotic regime is even harder. So it's an open question. It's a good one.
Yeah. So the one follow-up question would be like, what is the underlying flow dynamics? So there would be some chaotic flow dynamics related to it other than the bifurcation, so which reorganizes it to a high amplitude oscillation, right? So maybe like what triggers it? What kind?
Yeah.
And I'm just curious.
Yeah. So there are a couple things that happen as this flag sort of continues to desynchronize with the flow, right? So when it's really well synchronized for this low mass ratio, what you see is you know, I know you're familiar with the vortex nomenclature, right? So this would be a 2p structure where
Okay, I see.
each time the flag flaps to one side, it'll release a pair of vortices, and it goes to the other side and releases another pair of vortices, and so on and so forth. And as it desynchronizes, then the flow loses its ability to kind of, and the system loses its ability to shed in that same way. And so what one begins to see is the onset of an occasional kind of P,
Okay.
I don't know if I said S vortices, I meant to say P vortices here. And then you'll see the occasional shedding of an occasional single vortex that's commensurate with this thing not shedding in the same way. And so physically, you know, there's this desynchronization and the onset eventually of just this, it can't flap at all, right, onto the other side. It just gets stuck on one side. And that's commensurate with the change in the vortex dynamics that go from a 2p pair to kind of a 2p plus random s's every once in a while, to just something that this thing looks like a bluff body, and you see the usual one vortex sheds off the top, another vortex sheds off the bottom, and so on and so forth. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. We can discuss offline more on that. Yeah. So the one interesting observation actually I had for a very low Reynolds number case, Reynolds number of 20. So there you showed that like no flapping occurred for the low mass ratio cases, whereas flapping occurred for the high mass ratio cases. So in my experience, is it not a bit counterintuitive because the system is more unstable at a, like it is more prone to instabilities at low mass ratios, but it's not flapping, but at high mass ratio, it flaps. So could you please elaborate on that? Like what is the physics maybe?
Well, I think they're just different mechanisms, right? I think that, if there were kind of, well, yeah, let me not speak to that, but I think they're just different mechanisms that when you go to this low Reynolds number and the high mass regime, you know, there's this ability, you know, there must be this ability for an increase in flag inertia to sort of relax the viscous stresses in the fluid, right? And change the kind of effective stiffness within the fluid so that there's able to be some flapping. Now, it's not one that's driven by flow motion, right? This is a fluid elastic instability. This is kind of a flutter instability that's associated with a fully coupled system. And so, you know, what is it exactly that allows for a fluid elastic instability here, but not here? That's an open question, right? Why is there an unstable eigenvector here? It's not clear, but what is clear is that there is a fully coupled flutter-based fluid elastic instability that's associated with the flag at high inertia values being able to kind of relax the viscous stresses and make it flap. And that eventually, you know, the saturation amplitude of that increases and increases and increases to the point where it's able to flap over to the other side. But more than that, you know, the community doesn't know.
Okay, that's great. We can discuss offline. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming for the IBiM talk. So we are a bit over time. I'm sure like Dr. Goza would like to answer like more questions, but like anyway, like you can contact Dr. Goza directly through his email. All the information is listed in the information of his talk. So thanks for coming for everyone. So we hope to see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the invite. This was a real pleasure and a real privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy, everybody.
Yes.